Under the sweltering Texas sun, traffic on Highway 83 slowed to a crawl. But it wasn't because of an accident. Something much smaller and wilder had brought cars to a halt. A tiny bobcat kitten, desperate and determined, stood in the middle of the road, refusing to move. Officer Sarah Winters had handled her share of strange calls, but nothing quite like this. As she approached the trembling creature, she realized it wasn't just lost or injured. It was trying to tell them something. Then she saw it. A glint of metal strapped to its leg. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a mystery was waiting to be uncovered. What could a wild bobcat possibly be leading them toward? And why did it seem to be waiting for help? What began as a routine highway patrol was about to turn into a life-or-death investigation no one could have predicted. Before we begin, hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and tap the notification bell so you don't miss any of our news stories. The summer sun beat down on Highway 83 in the West Texas countryside, creating shimmering mirages across the asphalt stretching as far as the eye could see. Traffic flowed steadily, trucks and cars heading north toward Abilene or south to San Angelo. Most passengers were oblivious to the drama unfolding on the roadside. Officer Sarah Winters adjusted her Stetson against the glare, squinting at the dispatch notes on her cruiser's screen. At 34, she'd been with the Texas Department of Public Safety for 11 years. Wildlife calls rarely required immediate attention, but this one felt different. Reports of a small, aggressive animal disrupting traffic wasn't something she could ignore. Dispatch. This is Unit 247, responding to the wildlife incident at Highway 83, mile marker 143. ETA, 3 minutes, she said, easing off the accelerator. Roger that, Officer Winters, came the reply. Be advised, we've had additional calls. Motorists report what appears to be a juvenile bobcat displaying unusual behavior. Sarah's curiosity was piqued. In her experience, wild animals typically fled from highways, not toward them. Something was definitely off. She spotted the commotion before reaching the mile marker. A cluster of vehicles pulled onto the shoulder, drivers standing outside, pointing and snapping photos. With practiced efficiency, she pulled up behind the last vehicle, lights flashing to warn oncoming traffic. As she stepped out of the cruiser, the hot Texas air hit her like a wall. She adjusted her utility belt and approached a middle-aged man in a faded Dallas Cowboys t-shirt, who seemed to be managing the scene. Afternoon, sir. Officer Sarah Winters, DPS. Can you tell me what's going on? The man wiped sweat from his brow. Ma'am, there's a baby bobcat over yonder, he said, pointing toward the median. Been trying to cross for about 20 minutes now. Runs out, then retreats. Almost caused a pile-up when a semi had to brake hard to avoid it. Sarah nodded, scanning the area. Anyone try to approach it? No, ma'am. Wild animal and all. Plus, he hesitated. It seems distressed. Like it's trying to get our attention or something. Never seen anything like it. Sarah thanked him and carefully walked toward the median, hand resting instinctively on her holster. She'd dealt with injured wildlife before, and even a young predator could be dangerous. Then she saw it. A small bobcat kitten, no more than a few months old. Its spotted coat was dusty from the roadside. It paced nervously near the edge of the median, making small darting movements toward the road before retreating when vehicles approached. She kept her distance, observing. Something was wrong. The behavior wasn't random. It was frantic, almost purposeful. She raised her binoculars. That's when she spotted it. A small device attached to the cat's hind leg, marked with something blue. This bobcat wasn't entirely wild. Sarah returned to her cruiser and called the regional fish and wildlife office. 20 minutes later, a white pickup with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department logo pulled up behind her. Out stepped Dr. Stephen Mitchell, a wiry man in his 50s with sun-weathered skin and sharp, alert eyes. He'd been the regional wildlife biologist for over 20 years. If anyone could make sense of this, it was him. Dr. Mitchell, Sarah greeted, extending her hand. Appreciate you coming out so quickly. Call me Stephen, he replied, shaking her hand firmly. Dispatch mentioned a tagged bobcat. That's unusual enough to get me moving. Sarah filled him in as they approached the median, moving slowly so as not to startle the animal. There, she pointed. See the device on its leg? Stephen raised his binoculars. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered. That's not one of ours. What do you mean? Sarah asked. Wildlife Services uses specific tracking collars, usually around the neck. This is something different. He leaned in, focusing. There's a blue marker attached. Almost looks like. He trailed off, brow furrowed. The bobcat spotted them. Instead of running, it moved closer, stopping about 30 feet away. It made a small, urgent sound, then turned and took a few steps toward the forest bordering the highway. It looked back. It wants us to follow it, Stephen said. Amazed, like Lassie? Sarah asked skeptically. I know how it sounds, but I've worked with wildlife for 25 years. I've never seen a bobcat act like this. He squinted at the blue tag. Can I borrow your binoculars? Mine aren't strong enough. Sarah handed them over. Stephen adjusted the focus and locked in. There's a number, RW7734, he said, face going pale. Sarah, that's not a wildlife tag. That's an emergency location marker, the kind issued to hikers in protected parks. She blinked. Why would a bobcat have a hiker's emergency tag? Good question, Stephen replied grimly. Let me make a call, Stephen said. Retreating to his truck. 5 minutes later, he returned with a grave expression. I just spoke with the ranger station at Fortress Ridge State Park. They've had a missing hiker since yesterday, Robert Whitley, 42. Experienced outdoorsman. He checked in for a 3-day solo hike, but missed his scheduled check-in last night. Sarah's instincts kicked in, and the marker number matches, RW, are his initials, and 7734 was his campsite registration. Stephen nodded. They both looked at the bobcat, still waiting by the roadside, occasionally letting out that same urgent sound. This doesn't make sense, Sarah said. How would a bobcat end up with a hiker's emergency marker? Stephen's expression grew thoughtful. There might be an explanation. Let me check something. He pulled out his tablet and scrolled through several screens. Here, ranger records show Robert Whitley is a wildlife rehabilitator from Austin. Specializes in big cats. Sarah looked at the bobcat with a new perspective. So this could be one of his rescues. Maybe he was tracking it as part of a rehab program. It's possible, Stephen replied. But if that's the case, why is the bobcat here, and Robert isn't? The implication hung heavily between them. The bobcat let out another insistent cry and took several more steps toward the forest. I'm going to follow it, Sarah said. If there's any chance it knows where this hiker is, I'm coming with you, Stephen interrupted. If Robert's injured, we might need medical supplies. He rushed back to his truck and returned with a backpack containing a basic first aid kit, water, and emergency rations, a standard search and rescue pack. Sarah radioed dispatch. Dispatch, Officer Winters. We've got a potential missing person connected to the wildlife incident. Dr. Mitchell and I are heading into the forest to investigate. Requesting backup and search and rescue on standby. Copy that, Officer Winters. Be advised, nearest backup is 30 minutes out. Search and rescue has been notified and will stage until you confirm. Understood. We'll proceed with caution and maintain radio contact. The bobcat, seeming to understand their decision, turned and trotted toward the tree line, glancing back to ensure they were following. Never thought I'd be following a bobcat into the woods, Sarah muttered, directing bystanders to clear the area as they crossed the highway. Nature has a way of surprising us, Stephen said, especially when humans get involved. Once inside the forest, the temperature dropped beneath a canopy of oak and juniper trees. The bobcat stayed about 50 feet ahead, always visible but keeping its distance. It's staying on a clear path, Stephen observed. That's not normal behavior. Even partially rehabilitated bobcats would stick to cover. Sarah nodded, eyes scanning the ground. There, she pointed. Boot prints. Recent. Stephen knelt to examine them. Good eye. Fresh. Maybe a day old. Men's hiking boot, probably size 11 or 12. They continued following the bobcat, which maintained its steady pace. About a mile in, they reached a clearing. The underbrush had been disturbed. Broken branches, flattened grass, and scattered items. A water bottle, a torn backpack strap, and most troubling, small patches of dried blood on several leaves. Someone passed through here in a hurry, Sarah said, hand drifting toward her sidearm. Or fell, Stephen added, pointing to a steep drop-off at the edge of the clearing they hadn't noticed before. The bobcat had stopped there, pacing anxiously, repeating the same urgent cry. It approached the edge, looked down, then turned back to Sarah and Stephen expectantly. They exchanged a glance, then moved cautiously toward the edge. Below lay a ravine, about 30 feet deep, with a narrow stream running along the bottom. Partially hidden by a fallen tree was a human figure. "Robert!" Stephen shouted. "Robert Whitley." The figure stirred, lifting an arm in a weak wave. "He's alive," Sarah said with relief. She pressed her radio. "Dispatch, we've located the missing hiker. Ravine approximately 1 mile east of Highway 83, mile marker 143. Subject is alive but injured. Requesting immediate medical evacuation." "Copy that, Officer Winters. Search and rescue is mobilizing. ETA 45 minutes to your location." Sarah surveyed the ravine. "It's not too steep. We can get down." "I'll go first," Stephen said. "I've got the medical supplies." They carefully descended the slope, using tree trunks and rocks for support. The Bobcat surprised them by navigating its own path down with feline ease at the bottom. They found Robert Whitley conscious but clearly in distress. His leg was pinned under the fallen tree, and his face was pale from exposure and dehydration. When he saw the Bobcat approach, a weak smile spread across his face. "Nova," he whispered. "Good girl." The Bobcat, Nova, approached slowly and nuzzled Robert's outstretched hand. Stephen got to work assessing his injuries, while Sarah gave Robert water and radioed in his condition. "Compound fracture of the right tibia, possible concussion, dehydration," Stephen reported. "Stable for now." "Robert, can you tell us what happened?" Sarah asked. Robert took a shaky breath. "I was tracking Nova. She's part of my rehabilitation program. She was ready for her final wilderness assessment before release." He winced. Everything was going well until last night. A storm rolled in. Lightning struck a tree nearby, scared Nova off, which is natural. But the same strike weakened this tree. He gestured to the trunk pinning his leg. "I was following her trail when it fell. Couldn't reach my emergency beacon, so I attached my location marker to Nova's harness and told her to find help." Sarah and Stephen stared at him in amazement. "You trained a Bobcat to get help?" Sarah asked, incredulous. Robert chuckled weakly, then grimaced. "Not exactly. She was found as a very young kitten, raised around humans before she came to me. Part of her rehabilitation meant teaching her that roads mean humans," Robert explained, his voice filled with pride. "When she's frightened, she still associates roads with safety. I wasn't sure it would work, but I hoped she'd go to the road, and someone would notice her tag." Nova had settled next to Robert, her spotted body pressed gently against his side, watching the newcomers with cautious eyes. "That's incredible," Stephen said, as he applied a splint to Robert's leg. "You essentially improvised animal-led search and rescue." "I had faith in her," Robert said simply. The next hour passed in a blur of controlled chaos. The search and rescue team arrived with proper medical gear and a stretcher designed for ravine extractions. As they worked to free Robert's leg from beneath the fallen tree, Nova stayed close, watchful, but never interfering. Sarah couldn't help but be fascinated by the connection between man and animal. It defied everything she thought she knew about wildlife behavior. As the team prepared to move Robert, he called out weakly, "Nova, please, someone needs to look after her. She's not ready for full release yet." Stephen stepped forward without hesitation. "I'll take personal responsibility for her until you're back on your feet. You have my word." Relief washed over Robert's face as he was gently lifted onto the stretcher. "Thank you," he whispered. "Her carrier and supplies are at my campsite. Fortress Ridge, Site 7734. We'll find it," Stephen assured him. As Robert was carried up the ravine, Nova tried to follow, letting out soft, distressed cries. Sarah, acting on instinct, knelt to her level. "It's okay, girl. He's going to be all right. And you did good, real good." Nova looked at her with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand far more than any wild creature should. The story of Robert Whitley and Nova the Bobcat made local headlines the very next day. "Man's life saved by Bobcat companion." National news outlets quickly picked it up. A heartwarming tale of a wildlife rehabilitator rescued by the very animal he was preparing to release into the wild. Captured hearts across the country. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself driving to the Austin Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, where Robert worked. She hadn't been able to shake the story. When her sergeant suggested she do a follow-up as part of their community outreach program, she jumped at the opportunity. The center sat on 20 acres outside Austin, with modern buildings and large, naturalistic enclosures. A young volunteer greeted her and led her to a sunny room where Robert sat in a wheelchair, his casted leg propped up on a stool. "Officer Winters," he said warmly, extending his hand. "Good to finally meet you properly. Last time, I was a bit indisposed." Sarah laughed, shaking his hand. "Call me Sarah, please. And honestly, you were handling a compound fracture better than most people handle a paper cut." "Adrenaline is a wonderful thing," Robert chuckled. "And knowing Nova succeeded? That was better than any painkiller." "How is she?" Sarah asked that Robert's face lit up. "Why don't you see for yourself? We're about to start her afternoon training session." He wheeled himself outside toward a large enclosure where Dr. Stephen Mitchell was already waiting. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You've been coming down here?" "Twice a week," Robert said, catching her expression. "Stephen says he's never seen anything like her. He's documenting the process for a research paper." "Sarah," Stephen called out with a smile. Just in time for the show. Inside the enclosure, Nova moved gracefully, her gait fluid and precise. She had grown noticeably since Sarah had last seen her. Her kitten-like features had given way to the more powerful frame of an adolescent cat. "She's getting big," Sarah observed. "They grow quickly at this stage," Robert said with pride. "And she's thriving. The experience hasn't set back her rehabilitation. If anything, it's given us new insights into her cognitive abilities." Stephen opened a small gate, and they entered a protected observation area inside the enclosure. Nova noticed them immediately and approached, her gaze fixed on Sarah. "She remembers you," Robert said, surprised. "Is that unusual?" Sarah asked. "Very," Stephen replied. "Bobcats don't typically distinguish between individual humans, unless they've had extensive interaction. But Nova seems to recognize you specifically." Sarah felt an unexpected tug in her chest. As Nova looked up at her with those keen, golden eyes, "What happens to her now?" she asked softly. Robert exchanged a glance with Stephen. "That's actually become a complex question. Nova's case challenges some of our standard assumptions about rehabilitation," Stephen explained. "She's demonstrated an unusual ability to navigate both wild instincts and human trust. The traditional approach would be to minimize contact and aim for release," Robert added. "But some researchers, including Stephen, have proposed a new path." He wheeled closer to the fence. "We're developing a new program, wildlife ambassadors. Animals that, for various reasons, live between wild and domestic life. They help us educate the public and promote conservation." "And Nova would be your first ambassador?" Sarah asked. "She's a perfect candidate," Robert said. "She still has wild instincts, but she's formed selective bonds with humans. And after the rescue, the public is already emotionally invested in her story." They watched as Nova tackled a series of enrichment puzzles spread throughout the enclosure, solving each one with calm focus and surprising precision. "That rescue wasn't just luck, was it?" Sarah asked. "You really did train her." Robert shook his head gently. "Not the way people imagine. You can't train a bobcat like a dog. What I did was build associations. Roads mean humans. Humans mean help when you're in distress. The tracker means me." He smiled, eyes glistening. "I didn't know if it would work. It was a desperate gamble." "Well," Sarah said, eyes still on Nova, "it saved your life." Sarah said yes. Robert added softly. "And so did the donors." The publicity from the rescue had generated enough donations to fund their wildlife ambassador program for the next 3 years. "We're building a dedicated facility," he continued, "where visitors can learn about native Texas wildlife through animals like Nova, ones who can't be fully released." Speaking of publicity, Stephen chimed in. "The governor's office called this morning. They want to present both of you with a special commendation at the state conservation gala next month." Robert looked sheepish. "I told them Nova deserves the award, not me." Stephen laughed. "I believe their exact words were, 'We don't have a protocol for giving state honors to bobcats.' But they are using Nova's image on the new wildlife conservation license plate. So that's something." Sarah smiled, remembering the tiny, desperate bobcat that had blocked traffic on Highway 83 just a few weeks ago. Who could have imagined that the same creature would save a life and possibly change the way people view the relationship between humans and wildlife? As if sensing her thoughts, Nova approached the fence where Sarah stood, letting out a soft, chirring sound, almost like a greeting. "Would you like to feed her?" Robert asked, handing Sarah a pair of long tongs with a piece of meat clipped. At the end, Sarah hesitated, then accepted them. Under Robert's guidance, she extended the meat through a small feeding port. Nova took it gently, without aggression, then sat down to eat calmly, her intelligent eyes fixed on Sarah. "I never thought I'd be this close to a wild bobcat," Sarah said quietly. "She's teaching us that wild isn't as simple as we once believed," Robert replied. "There's a spectrum of behaviors, of adaptations. Nova's helping us understand that the line between wild and tame isn't as clear-cut as we imagined." 6 months later, Sarah stood in a crowd at the grand opening of the Texas Wildlife Ambassador Center. Her department had sent her as their official representative, but she would have come either way. She needed, to see how Nova's story had grown. The center was impressive. Naturalistic habitats gave the animals room to thrive while allowing visitors to observe and learn. Educational displays explained the circumstances that brought each ambassador here. Injuries that made release impossible, imprinting during critical development windows, or, like Nova, exceptional cognitive ability that built a bridge between the wild and the human world. That Nova's habitat was the centerpiece. A spacious enclosure with boulders, trees, and a small stream mimicked her native environment while allowing interactions with researchers and participation in educational programs. Robert, now fully recovered, led the ribbon-cutting ceremony and shared Nova's story with the crowd and media. When he mentioned Sarah's role in the rescue, he insisted she join him at the podium. "Officer Winters represented the best of human compassion that day," he told the crowd. "She didn't dismiss a wild animal as unimportant. She saw intelligence. She saw intention, even when it came in an unexpected form." After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed to explore the facility, Robert guided Sarah to a special observation area with a clear view into Nova's enclosure. "She's become quite the celebrity," Sarah said, watching Nova lounge regally on a rock ledge, unfazed by the admiring visitors. "Yes," Robert replied. "But more importantly, she's become an ambassador for her species. People who hear her story are donating, supporting habitat preservation. One bobcat has done more for Texas wildlife conservation in 6 months than a decade of outreach campaigns." Sarah watched as Nova stretched and repositioned herself, scanning the crowd with those golden, searching eyes, then locking briefly on Sarah with what almost felt like recognition. "Do you ever wonder what she's thinking?" Sarah asked. Robert smiled. "Every day, but I've learned to respect the mystery. Animals aren't just simplified versions of us. They're different, complex in their own ways." As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the center, Sarah found herself reflecting on how a simple call about a wild animal in the road had turned into something that changed so many lives: Robert's, Nova's, her own, and potentially thousands more. "You know," she said finally, "in 11 years of police work, I've never had a case quite like this one." Robert laughed. "I should hope not. Once in a lifetime is enough for me." They stood in quiet companionship, watching Nova, the bobcat who had once blocked traffic in desperation, now commanding attention with quiet confidence. Her presence alone had become a powerful symbol of how humans and animals could impact each other's lives. In unexpected ways, as the final visitors began to leave, Nova rose from her perch and padded gracefully toward the observation window where Sarah stood. For a long moment, their eyes met again, wild and human, predator and protector. A silent connection passed between them, unspoken but unmistakable. It was, Sarah thought, a fitting end to an extraordinary story, and perhaps the beginning of many more.